Michelangelo's nose was never straight, not in a single portrait made of him for the rest of his life. A flat, broken ridge halfway down it, visible in busts and sketches made when he was already the most famous artist alive. It was put there by a man with a hammer for a fist, in a church, over an insult nobody even remembers precisely anymore. That man is barely a footnote in most retellings of Michelangelo's life. But he went on to build one of the finest royal tombs in England. And 30 years after he threw that punch, in a different country, in a different language, his own temper put him in a cell where he chose to stop eating rather than keep living in it. His name was Pietro Torrigiano. This is the whole story, not just the punch everyone quotes, but what it actually cost him to be a man who solved every insult with his hands, right up until the last one killed him. Florence. Start in Florence in the early 1490, inside the Brancacci Chapel at Santa Maria del Carmine. The walls are covered in frescoes painted 60 years earlier by a young genius named Masaccio, telling the life of St. Peter. And one scene in particular, the tribute money, had quietly rewritten what painting was capable of. Figures built not from outline but from light and shadow alone, standing with real weight in real space, looking less like symbols on a wall and more like people who happen to be caught inside it. It's the reason every serious workshop in the city sends its students there to copy it, stroke for stroke, as training. This one chapel had become, within a generation, the unofficial classroom for an entire artistic revolution. And across the city, at the Palazzo Medici, Lorenzo de Medici, ruler of Florence in everything but title, has done something unusual. He's opened his own private garden, near the Church of San Marco, as a kind of informal school for the most promising teenagers in the city. He pays them an allowance. He puts a sculptor named Bertoldo di Giovanni in charge of them, a man who had once been Donatello's own assistant. And he gives these boys access to something almost nobody else in Florence has: his personal collection of ancient Roman statues, alongside drawings and models by Donatello, Brunelleschi, and Masaccio himself. Vasari later wrote that Lorenzo opened the garden because Florence, for all its painters, had a genuine shortage of good sculptors, and he wanted to grow his own. Two of the boys who end up in that garden and in that chapel with their sketchbooks are Pietro Torrigiano and a smaller, stranger, unmistakably gifted boy named Michelangelo Buonarroti. We don't know exactly what passed between them that day. What survives is Torrigiano's own account of it, given years later to a young sculptor named Benvenuto Cellini, who wrote it down. Michelangelo, Torrigiano said, had a habit of needling the other boys as he sketched, mocking their work, certain of his own superiority even as a teenager. On this occasion, Torrigiano decided he'd had enough. He didn't argue back. He didn't complain to Bertoldo or to anyone else in charge. He turned, clenched his fist, and hit Michelangelo full in the face. Here is Torrigiano's own description of it, in his own words, boasting about it years afterward, not apologizing for it. I felt bone and cartilage go down like biscuit beneath my knuckles. He told Cellini that Michelangelo would carry his mark to the grave. He was right. Every portrait of Michelangelo for the rest of a 9-decade life shows the same flattened bridge, the same permanent dent. It's worth pausing on why we even trust this story at all, given how long ago it happened. We're not relying on gossip or a hostile rumor written by an enemy. Benvenuto Cellini was himself one of the great sculptors and goldsmiths of the next generation. And by his own account, he heard this directly from Torrigiano's own mouth, told as a boast, not extracted as a confession. A man bragging about something ugly he did to someone he's trying to impress or recruit is one of the more reliable kinds of historical testimony there is. Nobody exaggerates their own cruelty by accident. Vasari, who wrote the first great biography of Michelangelo and all but worshipped him, tells the story differently. In Vasari's version, Torrigiano is consumed by simple jealousy, a talented but lesser artist, watching a stranger, more awkward boy quietly outclass him inside that same garden, and lashing out because he can't bear it. That framing probably isn't the whole truth. Vasari was writing decades later, as part of Michelangelo's own circle, shaping the legend of a misunderstood genius persecuted by smaller men. But it doesn't need to be the complete truth to contain some of it. Whatever the exact provocation, one fact survives both versions of the story intact. Torrigiano struck first, struck hard, and never once in his own telling of it expressed a shred of regret. Word of what happened reached Lorenzo de' Medici almost immediately, and Lorenzo, according to the sources, was furious. This wasn't a schoolyard scuffle between nobodies. Michelangelo was already, even at that age, understood inside that garden to be something rare, and permanently disfiguring him was close to unforgivable in the household that was actively grooming him for greatness. So Torrigiano did the only thing left available to him. He ran. That is where almost every telling of this story stops. A punch, a broken nose, a footnote in someone else's biography. But Torrigiano's own life didn't stop there. It was only just beginning, and where it went next is the part almost nobody ever tells. It's worth noting, too, that the Florence Torrigiano fled wasn't waiting for him to come back to it. Within 2 years of that punch, Lorenzo de' Medici was dead, his family driven out of the city, and Florence had handed itself over to a fire and brimstone friar named Girolamo Savonarola, who filled the same piazzas where the sculpture garden once stood with bonfires, burning paintings, books, mirrors, anything he judged a vanity. 4 years after that, Savonarola himself was burned in the very same square. The city, the patron, and the garden that had trained both of these teenagers were all gone within a decade. Torrigiano wasn't running from a golden age. He left just before it collapsed and never really needed to go back. Rome. He surfaces next in Rome, and Rome, for Torrigiano, is the quiet chapter, not because nothing happened there, but because so little of the detail survives compared to what came before and after. This is the Rome of Pope Alexander VI, a Borgia pontiff, notorious even by the standards of a notoriously worldly papacy, for the scale of his ambition and the splendor of his court. Torrigiano finds work there, helping the painter Pinturicchio model the elaborate stucco decoration of the Borgia apartments, the private rooms of the Pope himself, a suite so densely covered in gilded relief, painted ceilings, and imagery glorifying the Borgia family's own mythology, that later generations would hold it up as one of the great symbols of Renaissance excess. It's not fine sculpture in marble. It's fast, decorative, workshop-scale ornament made to impress at a glance rather than reward close study. But it pays, and it puts Torrigiano's hands inside the private residence of the most powerful man in the Western Church, working for a pope whose own family's ambition and scandal would become a byword for the era. Some accounts suggest he may have trained even earlier, before Florence, under that same Bertoldo di Giovanni in the Medici garden, meaning the man modeling ornamental stucco for a pope had, quite possibly, once shared a teacher with the boy whose face he broke. Rome is Torrigiano proving something, quietly, that a man who had fled his own home city in disgrace could still be trusted inside the private apartments of the most powerful man in Christendom. It is a bridge, not a destination, and soon enough, a far larger opportunity pulls him out of Italy altogether. England. Florentine merchants trading in London have heard about his work, and they persuade Torrigiano to cross the sea to England. By 1507, he is living in the precinct of St. Peter's, Westminster, a Florentine sculptor, in a country he has no ancestral claim to whatsoever, about to be handed the single most important artistic commission the English crown can offer. To understand why that commission matters, you need to understand what it's actually for. 22 years earlier, England had torn itself apart in a civil war that had run on and off for 3 decades. 2 rival branches of the same royal family, the houses of Lancaster and York, each convinced the crown belonged to them, trading the throne back and forth through battles, executions, and at least one king's disappearance that England still hasn't fully explained. Historians would later nickname it the Wars of the Roses, after the badges the 2 sides wore. It had already cost the country several kings within a single generation before Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant with a bloodline so thin it barely qualified him. Won it by force at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. To make that victory stick, he married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of a Yorkist king, whose bloodline was, if anything, stronger than his own. Their wedding, at Westminster Abbey in January 1486, wasn't just a marriage. It was a peace treaty in the shape of a ceremony, sealed with a new invented emblem, the Tudor rose, fusing the warring red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York into one symbol. And by every surviving account, including the historian Thomas Penn's, something genuine grew between them anyway. A marriage that began purely as political necessity and became, in Penn's words, one of mutual attraction, affection, and respect. That is the couple Pietro Torrigiano is commissioned to bury. Work on the tomb is already underway when Henry VII dies in 1509. The formal contract is signed in 1512. The finished monument is unveiled in 1517 and 1518. The terms alone tell you how seriously the crown is taking this. £1,500 for the king's own monument, a further £1,000 for the altar and its fittings, and £2,000 more for a planned tomb for Henry VIII that, in the end, is never built to Torrigiano's design. Torrigiano is also handed the tomb of Lady Margaret Beaufort, Henry's own mother, the formidable, relentless political operator, whose maneuvering had put the Tudor dynasty on the throne in the first place. She had given birth to Henry at only 13 years old, been married and widowed, and married again across 4 decades of the very civil war her son would end, and spent those decades quietly building the alliances and the money that eventually put an army behind him at Bosworth. By the time Torrigiano is commissioned to cast her likeness, she is one of the most powerful women in England in her own right. And the sculptor who once fled Florence for hitting a boy in the face is now trusted with immortalizing the woman who outmaneuvered a kingdom. The setting itself is almost as remarkable as what's inside it. Henry VII commissioned an entirely new chapel to house his tomb, the last great masterpiece of English medieval architecture, crowned with a fan-vaulted ceiling unlike anything built before it, the first in England to combine that fan vaulting with hanging stone pendants, engineered by the master mason Robert Jannens the Younger. And inside that chapel, on a base of black marble ringed with gilt copper medallions of the Virgin and Henry's own patron saints, behind a fine iron grille lie the gilt bronze effigies Torrigiano cast, the king and his queen, hands clasped together in prayer, in a vault set beneath the floor rather than in a raised tomb chest above it. The first time English monarchs had ever been buried that way. Art historian John Pope Hennessy, one of the most respected scholars of Renaissance sculpture who ever lived, called the finished tomb the finest Renaissance work north of the Alps. That is one expert's judgment, not a universal verdict, but it's a serious one from a man who spent an entire career comparing tombs across a continent. And here is what makes it more than an old opinion sitting in a book. Torrigiano is credited plainly as the first artist to bring the Italian Renaissance style into England at all. Before this tomb, nothing quite like it existed on the island. You don't have to take anyone's word for any of that. Walk into Westminster Abbey today, past the graves of poets and prime ministers, into the Henry VII Lady Chapel, and the bronze king and queen Torrigiano cast 5 centuries ago are still lying there, gilded and serene, exactly where he left them. Look closely at how those two faces were actually made, and the tomb gets stranger, not simpler. Henry VII features weren't invented from memory or flattered into idealized calm, the way most royal portraiture of the era was. The face on that effigy was very likely cast from a mold taken directly off the king's own corpse, a death mask pressed onto Henry VII's skin in the hours after he died, then used as the literal template for the bronze that would represent him for the rest of history. The whole figure was built the old way, a wax model layered over a clay core encased, the wax melted out, molten bronze poured into the space it left behind, and only afterward gilded, by brushing on a paste of gold mixed with liquid mercury and heating the whole surface until the mercury burned away and left the gold fused to it underneath. The bronze itself was cast back in Florence. The city Torrigiano had fled as a disgraced teenager and shipped across the sea to be assembled in Westminster by 1518, meaning the boy who ran from Florence in humiliation sent his own work back to it, years later, as raw material for a king's tomb. What makes the finished effigies genuinely new, and not just competent, is the fusion underneath the gilding. English tomb sculpture up to that point was still largely Gothic in spirit, stiff, formal, symbolic bodies meant to represent a rank rather than a person. Torrigiano brought something the English court had never really seen up close: Italian Renaissance naturalism, faces and hands modeled to look like they belonged to two specific human beings who had actually lived, married, and died, laid gently over a framework the English masons still recognized as their own. It's the seam between two traditions, cast in bronze, and it's the reason art historians still point to this tomb as the moment the Renaissance itself formally arrives on English soil. And here's the detail almost nobody puts next to the other one. While Torrigiano was in London casting that king's death mask into bronze, Michelangelo, the same boy whose nose he'd broken, was 3 countries away in Rome, flat on his back on a wooden scaffold, painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The contract for the ceiling was signed in 1508. The finished work was unveiled to the public on the 1st of November, 1512, the same year Torrigiano's own contract for Henry VII's tomb was formally signed. Neither man knew the other was, at that exact moment, doing the work that would define how history remembered him. One was becoming untouchable. The other was becoming, for a little while, genuinely great in his own right, in a country neither of them had grown up in. The man who broke Michelangelo's nose in a fit of temper had become, in another country, working in a language he'd had to learn from nothing, one of the most accomplished tomb makers in Europe. And the punch had never fully let go of him. Years later, when Torrigiano returns briefly to Italy to recruit skilled assistants for his English commissions, he tries to hire a gifted young sculptor named Benvenuto Cellini, the very same Cellini who had once sat and listened to him boast about Michelangelo's nose and written it down. Cellini refuses. Partly, he says, it's Torrigiano's swaggering, overbearing manner, but partly, plainly, it's that story. He says he can no longer bear the sight of a man who talks about maiming a genius the way other men talk about a good day's hunting. The reputation that had driven him out of Florence as a teenager is still, decades later, costing him the people he wants beside him. But it hadn't stopped him from becoming great. It had only ever cost him company. Seville. Then Torrigiano moves once more, and this time the direction of his life turns for good. By 1522, he is in Seville, in the household patronage of Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, the Duke of Arcos, one of the city's most powerful noblemen. It's worth pausing on exactly what kind of city he's walked into. In 1503, the Spanish crown had founded an institution in Seville called the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, to control and tax every ship, every voyage, every ounce of precious metal moving between Spain and its new possessions across the Atlantic. In 1522, the very year Torrigiano arrives, the crown formalizes a fleet system to move that wealth more efficiently. One great convoy sailing out to the Indies, another sailing back laden with cargo, on a fixed and guarded schedule. Along Seville's docks, ships are unloaded under armed watch, their holds weighed and logged and taxed by crown officials before a single coin changes hands with anyone else. Seville, in other words, is standing at the mouth of a river of New World gold and silver that is about to turn it into one of the richest cities in Europe, a place where, within a generation, the crown alone will be skimming a fifth of every incoming shipment straight off the top, just as its royal tax, and where the annual flood of precious metal will multiply more than 30 times over across the century. Keep that number in mind. It matters for what happens next. The Duke of Arcos commissions Torrigiano to carve a marble Virgin and Child. By some accounts, not even his first attempt at the subject for this same patron, but a second, more ambitious version. Torrigiano, by now a man in his 50s with a king's tomb already behind him, throws himself into it completely. This is someone still hungry for the next great patron who might carry his name further, still working to prove something even after England. The result, by every surviving account, is extraordinary. A masterpiece from a sculptor who by now genuinely knew how to make marble breathe like skin. The Duke is delighted with it. He sends servants to collect the finished statue, and in a gesture clearly meant to look generous, meant to be seen, he has them arrive loaded down with heavy purses, as though carrying a fortune in payment for a fortune of a statue. Torrigiano opens the purses expecting gold. What pours out instead is a handful of maravedis, the smallest, least valuable coin circulating in Spain at the time, the kind of change a laborer might carry, not the currency of noblemen settling a debt with a master sculptor. The entire payment, once counted out, comes to somewhere around 30 ducats. For a marble masterpiece he had spent months perfecting, in a city that is, at that exact moment, drowning in more New World gold than Europe has ever seen in one place before. One account even names the man who delivers the final insult to him directly, a fellow Florentine living in Seville, Nicoloso Pisano, who tells Torrigiano plainly and precisely how little his patron actually thought the work, and by extension him, was worth. Picture the moment itself. A man past 50 who has cast a king in bronze, who has built the finest tomb north of the Alps, standing in his own workshop, counting out small coins that don't even add up to what a minor commission would pay, in a city where ships are unloading literal chests of gold a few streets away. Torrigiano doesn't write an angry letter. He doesn't take the Duke to court, or to the crown, or to anyone with actual power over the man. He picks up a hammer, walks over to his own finished Virgin and Child, the very statue the Duke had just praised as a triumph, and smashes it to pieces with his own hands, in what must have taken more than a single blow. Marble doesn't shatter like glass, and by every account this was total destruction, not a symbolic crack. It is, in a strange and exact way, the same gesture as the punch in Florence, 30 years apart, aimed this time at his own work instead of someone else's face. An insult lands, and instead of absorbing it, Pietro Torrigiano destroys the nearest beautiful thing within reach. Only this time, the beautiful thing belongs entirely to him. What happens next is where the historical record itself starts to disagree, and it's worth being honest about that, instead of pretending the story is cleaner than it actually is. In the account handed down by Vasari, the Duke is the villain of this final act, humiliated that his gift had been destroyed in front of his own household. He denounces Torrigiano to the Spanish Inquisition as a heretic, weaponizing religious law to settle what was really just a personal grudge. But scholars examining the same surviving records have proposed a different, stranger reading, that Torrigiano in his final years had grown increasingly consumed by an intense, almost punishing religious devotion, and that destroying a sacred image, even one he had carved with his own hands, was read by the authorities not as an act of wounded artistic pride at all, but as something closer to iconoclasm, a crime against the faith itself. Nobody alive today can prove definitively which version is true. Both readings survive, arguing with each other across 5 centuries of the same handful of documents. What isn't in dispute is the machinery he was fed into once the denunciation was made. By the early 1500s, the Spanish Inquisition's procedure, laid down decades earlier by Tomás de Torquemada in a code of 28 articles, no longer offered any grace period for voluntary confession. It ran on edicts of faith instead, public calls for the community itself to come forward and name the guilty. Denunciations were anonymous. The accused was never told who had reported him. Once denounced, his property could be seized on the spot to cover the cost of his own imprisonment and trial. And the trial itself, by design, presumed guilt from the outset. Its entire purpose was to extract a confession, and inquisitors of the period were formally permitted to use water forced down the throat, the rack, or suspension by the wrists with weights bound to the feet, to get one. There is no surviving record that Torrigiano himself was tortured in this specific way. What is recorded is simpler, and in its own way just as bleak. A man who had spent 30 years answering every humiliation with his hands, placed somewhere his hands could no longer answer anything at all, and who chose, in the end, to stop eating rather than wait to find out what the Inquisition intended to do with him next. Into that machinery, in 1527 or 1528, went Pietro Torrigiano. He was arrested and confined to a cell in Seville. And there, according to the surviving accounts, he refused to eat. Not starved by his captors in the end, but starved by his own choice. A state one source describes only as profound melancholy, and nothing more specific than that. In 1528, in that cell he died. Think for a moment about the actual shape of that life. A teenager in Florence throws one punch and marks the most famous artist in human history for the rest of his life, in front of witnesses, permanently. That same young man, 30 years and 3 countries later, builds a royal tomb so accomplished that a 5-century-old English institution still guards it today, behind iron, in its own private chapel. And that same man, still carrying the identical temper that made the very first blow land in a church full of teenagers, ends his life refusing food in an Inquisition cell. Over 30 ducats of calculated insult, and a marble virgin and child he had shattered with his own hand. Michelangelo, meanwhile, lived roughly 4 more decades past Torrigiano's death, and became simply the most famous artist who has ever lived. The ceiling, the David, the dome of St. Peter's, a name that has outlasted every empire that rose and fell around him in the centuries since. Almost every book written about him mentions, in passing, that someone broke his nose once, as a teenager, and then moved straight on to the next chapter. It's true. It happened exactly the way Torrigiano boasted that it did, to a young Cellini in a room, decades before either of them was famous enough for anyone to think the story worth writing down carefully. But the man who threw that punch was never just a footnote in his own life, whatever space he's been given in everyone else's. He was, for a while, the finest tomb maker England had, right up until the same temper that broke Michelangelo's face finally broke something of his own in a foreign cell that he could never put back together again. There's a version of this story that reads as a simple morality tale. Violent young man never learns. Violent young man dies alone for it. It's tempting, and it isn't quite honest. Between the punch and the cell, there were 30 years in which that same temper, redirected, built something that has genuinely outlasted him. A king and queen still lying in gilded bronze under a ceiling nobody has matched since. In a country that gave a disgraced Florentine teenager a second chance, nobody in Florence was ever going to offer him. The rage didn't vanish in England. It just had nothing in front of it worth breaking for a little while. The tragedy of Pietro Torrigiano isn't that he never changed. It's that the version of him capable of Westminster and the version of him capable of a hammer and a Spanish Inquisition cell were, every single time, exactly the same man. That's the part the trivia never bothers to tell you. Not just that a man once broke Michelangelo's nose, but who he had to become, and what he eventually destroyed with his own hands, to still be exactly that same man, 30 years and 3 countries later, and what happens to genuinely gifted people when nobody, including themselves, ever finds a way to take the hammer out of their hand. Torrigiano isn't even the only sculptor of this era, whose private violence is buried under the beauty of what he made. Decades later, in Rome, a young genius named Gian Lorenzo Bernini would carve the single tenderest portrait bust of the entire Baroque age, of a woman he loved, and then, on discovering she'd betrayed him, send a man to cut her face open with a razor, while he himself faced no real punishment at all. If a sculptor's temper hiding behind his masterpiece is a story that gets its hooks into you, that one is worse. That's next